Good afternoon, and thank you for joining this webinar entitled The Clean Slate Model, Stealing Criminal Records Through Automated Computer Queries. My name is Alex Lussman, Policy Analyst for the Criminal Records Project at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. The Council of State Governments Justice Center provides practical, nonpartisan, research-driven strategies and tools to increase public safety and strengthen communities. Before getting started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping points about how the webinar works. If you encounter any technical problems, including audio problems, during this webinar, please call WebEx Technical Support at 866-229-3239. That number again, 866-229-3239. This information is also located in the chat box at the right of the screen. Please understand that there may be some individual technical problems we cannot resolve. For this reason, we are recording this webinar and will post it on our website at cleanslateclearinghouse.org, where it will remain accessible. At any time during this webinar, you can ask a question by typing it into the Q&A box in the bottom right-hand portion of your screen. This includes both technical and content-related questions. We will reply to technical questions as we go. For content-related questions, we will keep a running list, and the presenters will address them at the end of the webinar. We will do our best to get through as many questions as possible. Today's presenters are Sharon Dietrich, Litigation Director at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia, and Rebecca Vallas, Vice President in the Poverty to Prosperity Program at the Center for American Progress. We will be hearing from them shortly. This webinar is part of the Clean Slate Clearinghouse, a project funded by the U.S. Department of Labor and the U.S. Department of Justice. The Clean Slate Clearinghouse was created to support juvenile and adult criminal record clearance around the country by, first, providing up-to-date information on record clearance, as well as contact information for legal service providers in all U.S. states and territories. Second, developing tools and resources for legal service providers currently engaged in record clearance work, or those who want to expand their criminal record clearance services. And third, providing information to compare record clearance policies across jurisdictions and to learn about best practices. The site was designed to serve three target audiences: people with criminal records who are seeking to have their records cleared, legal service providers who offer record clearance services, and policymakers and stakeholders who want to compare record clearance policies across the country. The site is useful for reentry and workforce service providers who can connect people to services, indigent defense attorneys and pro bono attorneys who are interested in starting or expanding record clearance practice, and researchers and journalists who want to compare trends in record clearance legislation across the country. The primary goals of the Clean Slate Clearinghouse are to provide accessible, up-to-date information for record clearance policies across the country and to increase the capacity of legal service providers while creating a community of practice for those doing record clearance work. We encourage you to visit the website and sign up for our newsletter to stay updated on news, events, and webinars such as this one. Now, I'll turn it over to Sharon Dietrich.
Hi, Sharon, you might be on mute.
Thank you. Indeed, I was. Hopefully, we will improve from here. Thank you to the Clearinghouse for having Rebecca and me speak today on Clean Slate. she and I have been working on a legislative campaign in Pennsylvania to provide information and technical support about why Clean Slate makes good policy sense for everyone. And so let us start by talking about what Clean Slate as we define it is. So many of you know, I'm sure, that generally when people seal or expunge a criminal case, they do it by filing a petition with the court. And that usually requires a court hearing. It requires DAs to be involved. It requires the former defendant to seek a lawyer, usually go before a judge. There's a ruling, then there's data entry, and there's implementation. And those are a lot of steps for what is a procedure in which oftentimes a very high percentage of petitions are granted. So Clean Slate takes the perspective that maybe there is a way to do this sealing of minor and old criminal records without all those steps. And so we have worked on conceptualizing a procedure where instead of having a court hearing, instead you apply well-drawn rules and just embed them in a computer query and have the computer essentially apply the rules, and if you are eligible under the rules, your case is sealed. It cuts out all the work. It cuts out the need for lawyers and judges and DAs and even data entry people, and therefore it can be done on a mass basis that would be impossible if you're sealing cases one by one. We have designed the Clean Slate concept as being sealing rather than expungement. Those terms have different meanings in different states. Each state is almost unique in whether they have sealing, expungement, set aside, and what those terms mean are defined differently. But the general concept we wanted to get here is that because this is a mass computerized process, we think sealing probably makes more sense than expungement. And by sealing, we mean that the information would continue to be available to law enforcement, but not the general public, such as employers, landlords, educational institutions, and others running background checks. So that's what Clean Slate is. And let me turn it over to Rebecca to tell you where this concept came from.
Thanks so much, Sharon, and thanks to the Clearinghouse for hosting this conversation today. So it's great to be talking with a bunch of folks who care about these issues and who are looking for ways to advance solutions in a time where it feels like there isn't a lot of talk about real solutions in Washington. I know that's certainly how I'm feeling being in Washington and wishing that I were not here most of the time. I miss being in Philadelphia with you, Sharon. So the origin of the Clean Slate concept was, of course, me and Sharon having a couple glasses of wine and banging our heads against the wall, talking about how as much as there's been all of this fabulous progress at the state level around expungement and record clearing, that the limiting factor there is, of course, the fact that one-off petitions for expungements have to go in front of judges, have to be filed, sometimes are opposed by DAs, that there's all this process involved that really makes it necessary in most cases for people who are eligible and in demand for an expungement or sealing of their record to find a lawyer. And as you guys know better than almost anyone, and as I certainly saw in my legal aid days and as Sharon still sees every single day in Philadelphia at CLS, there are all kinds of people who need record clearing and are eligible for it, but who are never going to be able to find lawyers because of the massive inadequate supply of legal services and really limited alternative options when it comes to legal help for folks who are in need on this front and on so many fronts. And so we were thinking together about how could we crack that nut of expanding record clearing to mass quantities of people without the need for one-off petitions, one-by-one seeking of help in the courts. And we started to think about how computer queries and that automation that Sharon has just described could be the way to extend record clearing and the associated benefits to a much wider population of folks than petition-by-petition models of expungement and sealing. And so that was really where the idea originated from. And so we published it as sort of our big think idea in a report back in 2014. It feels like a million years ago, but that the Center for American Progress joined forces with CLS in publishing back in 2014. And since then, there has been tremendous attention around this idea, and as we'll be talking about, lots of state-level traction, particularly in Pennsylvania, where this all started. Sharon, I'll go to the next slide.
All right.
Is it letting you go to the next slide? Oh, there we go. Beautiful. So as I think you guys know better than anyone, getting your record cleared is, of course, the best way to help somebody with a record move on with their life and have a fair shot at employment, at housing, at education and training and all of the other building blocks of economic security that can be shut off for people even with minor records. And so what we had realized in thinking about how to extend this to much larger groups of people was that the automation of that query that is currently being done in a lot of places sort of on a manual basis and in front of judges could be done really through a computer algorithm. And a couple of the other things that have sort of come to light as huge pros in favor of the clean slate model of automatic sealing over the individual filing of petitions include not just the mass numbers of people who can be helped automatically, but also the tremendous savings that will accrue to the courts and to all of the other stakeholders who are currently overtaxed and overburdened and under-resourced in getting through what can be an extremely large workload and one that can result in all kinds of waiting periods and delays for people who are actually even able to navigate the process. And then another bonus, of course, is the avoidance of filing fees that can be another obstacle for folks to getting their records cleared if they're having to go through a manual expungement or sealing filing process. Sharon, back over to you.
Thanks. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the limitations of Clean Slate. And let me say that one of the most important things to understand about Clean Slate is actually the second bullet on this slide. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the technological environment in your state and how that could have an impact on how and even if Clean Slate makes sense for you. A very key concept is that for mass sealing to be done, you need to go with what can be done by technology, and you need to avoid manual labor. So essentially, you need to be very clear on what data is in the databases of your courts, your central repository, which is probably your state police, and you need to design a proposal that does not have people looking at huge numbers of lists one by one, that does not involve redacting documents one by one, because we're talking about massive number of cases being sealed through Clean Slate. And if you have to do the manual labor, the costs of the proposal become entirely unwieldy. Now, the technological environment is really key to feasibility of Clean Slate because you need to be able to shut down effectively through your computer query the data that would be available to background screeners from your state databases. So part of what makes Pennsylvania such a good state for Clean Slate is that we have good data, both at the state police and at the Administrative Office of Pennsylvania Courts, that comprises about 90%, if not more, of all background screening in Pennsylvania. And their data is centralized. That's really particularly important for the courts because some states do not have centralized electronic data. They have maybe county-by-county data that is not connected, but you need to be able to run a query that closes down the court data by just running that query. And if you don't have that, and it's also very helpful if the courts and the central repository's data already talks to each other. There's a technological bridge between their databases, as there was here in Pennsylvania. So bear in mind that every state is going to be different. They're going to be different in terms of whether there's centralized data, what elements are in the databases, how background checks are compiled by private vendors using your state's data. And these are really important things to learn about if you don't know about them before you embark on thinking about applying Clean Slate in your state. So the fact that so much technology is involved can make this very complicated legislation, but definitely legislation that can be done to great advantage, which is what we'll be talking about when we get more deeply into the Pennsylvania bill that has been moving through our state house here. But very important to understand the data that's available. Let me give you a concrete example of why, from even a policy perspective, being on top of the data is important. While we were talking about the contours of our bill in Pennsylvania, there were certainly stakeholders that wanted our time periods for sealing to run from the date that the person's sentence was completed. Now, that is not information that we have in our databases. Neither the state police nor the Administrative Office of Pennsylvania Courts maintain that data. So we have been very clear that that date has got to run from the date that the case was disposed of, rather than the completion of the sentence. We might have made a different policy change had we had that data available to us, but we simply did not. So the interplay between technology and policy is complex but really important when designing a Clean Slate policy. Now, two less important things and then we'll move on. Clean Slate probably is better for what I would call easy cases, where there is general consensus that if you have a certain set of circumstances, it makes sense for there to be sealing. So for that reason, in Pennsylvania, we are focused on sealing misdemeanors, summary offenses, and cases where there were arrests but no convictions. Now, you could certainly do felony sealing under a Clean Slate model, but stakeholders might be more uncomfortable doing that and would prefer for those former defendants to go in front of a judge and let a judge make that decision, maybe balancing different factual issues. But Clean Slate is good for cases where pretty much everyone can agree, yes, if your misdemeanor is 10 years old and was nonviolent, your case should be sealed up. And then the second thing I wanted to say is you simply cannot seal paper records in this manner because, again, you're talking about potentially millions of cases. If you were telling your central repository you need to, say, segregate or shred millions of cases, they would ask you where the staff is going to come from for that. But in all honesty, most people need help with their background checks, not with the paper that exists in the central repository's filing bins. And so if you're able to seal the electronic data that commercial screeners are using to prepare background checks, you have pretty much done what needs to be done. This is not quite as thorough as if you got an order for sealing in Pennsylvania where those paper documents would be taken care of. But it does the trick of keeping the data from the background screeners so the background check will come back without showing the case, and the person will have a better chance of getting a job. We have, of course, retained the option for any individual who wants to do sealing or expungement traditional way to do that. They can file a petition, but Clean Slate will help many thousands to millions of more people who would not probably find themselves on their way to traditional expungement or sealing. Now, moving to the Pennsylvania bill, which at this point is moving along nicely. We drafted a bill back in 2016 that mostly sealed nonviolent misdemeanor convictions after 10 years and non-convictions 60 days after disposition. In the House bill that recently was enacted by the House, it also adds summary offenses after 10 years. So those are the things that would be sealed automatically. Another part of the bill that was very important to me was to use this as an opportunity to expand more generally what is eligible for sealing. And currently in Pennsylvania, we can only seal or expunge things starting at second-degree misdemeanors, which puts us in the middle of the pack at best among the states, where many states now are sealing felonies, but we are not. So this bill will at least make it possible to seal first-degree misdemeanors, which is very important to many of our clients who are not currently in a position to do that. So the bill has turned out to be quite popular. It has drawn a lot of support from a lot of quarters, as we'll talk about shortly. So it passed the Senate unanimously, and before we even started, even more than half of the Senate had signed on as co-sponsors from both sides of the aisle, and it passed our state House just last week with only 2 dissenting votes. So the entire General Assembly in Pennsylvania, only 2 members have voted against the bill. Rebecca, back to you.
Thanks, Sharon. So building on what Sharon just described and digging a little bit into some of who else has been behind this bill and helpful and part of the coalition, Sharon, can you take me to the next slide on partners?
Yep, sorry.
It has not just been a wonderful partnership between Community Legal Services in Pennsylvania and the Center for American Progress in Washington. It's also been a tremendous bipartisan and really transpartisan partnership that has grown up in support of the Clean Slate idea. And that's true not just of the Pennsylvania bill, it's actually true of the Clean Slate concept writ large. And so one of the vehicles for socializing the idea among national partners, as well as a lot of folks that frankly are not the usual suspects that CAP is hanging out with, is the Justice Action Network, the U.S. Justice Action Network, and they are a transpartisan coalition that CAP was a founding member of a few years back that grew up around the bipartisan momentum around criminal justice reform that we all remember so well and that feels like so many lifetimes ago because it was such a different time in Washington and in Congress. But that coalition is still in force and has been a tremendous asset to bring bringing together a lot of the folks who have been the partners that have made this kind of a bipartisan legislative campaign not just possible but successful. And some of those partners who will illustrate exactly how wide-ranging the political interest and support for this idea has been include Right on Crime, which you guys will be familiar with as one of the conservative leaders on criminal justice reform, and in particular, reentry and removing barriers to opportunity for people with records policies being a big focus for them, but also the Faith and Freedom Coalition, which works heavily in the states as well as in D.C. From sort of a conservative faith perspective. Freedom Works, a whole range of conservative groups that we don't even have time to go through right now, but who are not your average partners for a place like the Center for American Progress, but who have come to the table because they see this as not just good for individuals with records on a values basis. Some folks do come from kind of the faith and the moral perspective, but also because they see it as a good government, getting the reach of big government out of the way. They see it as a way to reduce poverty without actually spending any money, that sort of holy grail thing that so many of us are constantly reaching for in political climates that can have cost constraints. And the fact of, and Sharon will dig into some of the reasons why we've brought a lot of these folks together and some of the more compelling arguments that have brought folks together from left and right. But what has really cropped up is a truly transpartisan partnership that has brought tremendous bipartisan and even transpartisan. I keep saying transpartisan intentionally because it's not just right and left. There's also a strong libertarian contingent who has been heavily involved in criminal justice reform efforts and in Clean Slate in particular because of that kind of constraining the big reach of government argument that they find extremely compelling. And this coalition has cropped up in a way that has brought tremendous transpartisan credibility to the work at the state level. So it has, I'll take the next slide, Sharon, has brought us to a combination of folks championing this bill in Pennsylvania who otherwise would never have been possible, given that these are not folks, in some cases, I'm looking at the R's on this, particularly the prime sponsor in the Senate, Senator Scott Wagner. He's the single most conservative member of the entire Pennsylvania legislature. Sharon, I think I'm on strong ground saying that that is still true. He, in fact, is challenging the sitting governor, Tom Wolf, who's a Democrat, and that is not a person who necessarily would be chomping at the bit to take a meeting with the Center for American Progress or potentially even with community legal services, but being able to come in and say, actually, we've got this broad range of strange bedfellows who have all come together, who have blessed this and who have said this really hits the sweet spot in terms of bipartisan, transpartisan policy solutions that we can all agree are a win-win and get it right on so many different fronts. It's been possible to bring together Scott Wagner, most conservative member of the Pennsylvania legislature, together with folks like Senator Tony Williams, who had previously run for mayor of Philadelphia as a Democrat, together with another Philadelphia Democrat who's been a real champion on these issues, Representative Jordan Harris, together with another conservative Republican from outside of Philadelphia, Representative Cheryl Delosier. The bill itself quickly earned enough co-sponsors from both parties in both chambers to actually be able to pass outright just with its co-sponsors, and that was something that happened fairly quickly and fairly easily because of all of these different folks across the political spectrum putting their imprimatur on it and saying this is something that we all agree is the right way to go. And I think there's probably nothing that better illustrates the bipartisan kumbaya that has been found around this idea and this legislative campaign in Pennsylvania, but as an idea writ large as well, as I mentioned, than the fact that the most conservative member of the Pennsylvania legislature is the one championing it, and yet you've got the governor, whom he is challenging in the upcoming gubernatorial election from the other side of the aisle. The governor still endorsed the bill and is eager to get it to his desk and to sign it, and I think that probably captures better than anything the bipartisan love fest that this bill has been and that this idea has the potential to bring about. And I think an important note that I'll make in terms of how all of these partners have worked together is that it's been truly essential that Community Legal Services has been the anchor and really the lead organization championing the campaign in the state because of their on-the-ground presence and expertise, their reputation in the state, and their role at the heart of a lot of the networks that are and coalitions that are now championing and moving this bill forward. CAP has been a partner from Washington, bringing together some of that coalition infrastructure, bringing together some of those strange bedfellows, as well as research expertise and other communications, messaging, some of those things that we can bring to bear to add capacity to the campaign. And CLS has really been the technical lead in ways that have been absolutely critical, and which makes sense following Sharon's discussion earlier just a few minutes ago about the importance of getting the technical components of this bill right. So giving you a glimpse of some of how we've worked together and how that coalition has come together and functioned so well. Sharon, back to you.
So we started from a very bipartisan place with this bill, with our sponsors, with our friends from Washington and their Bipartisan Justice Action Network coalition. But let me say that has not been the traditional way that expungement bills have been handled or passed or viewed in Harrisburg. This has been a very different campaign, and it had a lot to do with Republican leadership taking on the lead sponsorship of the bills. In the past, getting any kind of expungement or ceiling expansion passed has been very difficult and has not been seen as a bipartisan thing. But from the jump between the partners endorsing it and the partners sponsoring it among the legislative membership, it's been a bipartisan bill. But that bipartisan nature has been like a snowball rolling downhill ever since it was first introduced back in 2016. So to give you a sense of some of the other supporters of this bill, we have just a partial list here of what would be a very long list when we're through with this campaign of people from all kinds of interests that have lined up behind the bill. Secretary John Wetzel, who has been the Corrections Secretary in Pennsylvania now through 2 administrations, a Republican one and a Democratic one. He has very serious credibility with right-leaning conservative groups, and Secretary Wetzel was very important by helping entities like the Commonwealth Foundation recognize that they had an interest in this bill. I cannot say enough about the importance of the state and local chambers of commerce. And in fact, when the House recently voted on this bill, my understanding is that it was perceived as a bill that was not only all right with business interests, but was supported and desired by business interests. And to me, that is a real insight into what is a very strong approach for trying to address issues of expungement, even more commonly, simply expanding expungement statutes. If business interests will line up behind them and say they support them, that can only create a better legislative environment, it seems to me. And we're hearing that that is exactly the approach that is being taken in some states. The case that business has made is that this is a very difficult time to find qualified employees, and they would be better able to hire certain justice-involved individuals if their records were sealed. And so the chamber came on board, and we were told that that was very influential with the Republican caucus when the bill went through the House recently. City of Philadelphia came on quickly as a supporter, and then without us even knowing what was going to happen, we started to see editorials and op-eds from places we didn't even expect. So Philadelphia is one thing. Reading and York, small cities, Reading in particular with a large poverty population, quickly wrote editorials supporting the bill, which was quite delightful and fairly unexpected. The press sometimes is not quick to embrace the closing down of publicly available information through expungement and sealing, but the papers in Reading and York did so. One day we learned that the Pittsburgh district attorney was going to issue an op-ed in support of the bill, which he did, and urged it to be passed as soon as possible. Again, having law enforcement support public like that from a big city DA, very useful. And then, surprisingly, there was an op-ed from Uber, again, not solicited by those of us working on the bill, but simply saying, we think this would be a good bill, we support it as well. I had a friend tell me that Uber was trying to join on to our popular bill for its own popularity, and I thought the day that an expungement or sealing bill becomes a popular bill shows that we've made substantial progress. So, so since the time that we prepared the slide, another important party that's come on in support of the bill is Koch Industries. So we have this simply phenomenal array of organizations that have been willing to support our Clean Slate bill. Coming from a completely different place, there was a point at which the bill was kind of languishing in the House side after it had passed the Senate, and we suddenly had outreach from representatives for several players with the Philadelphia Eagles saying that they would like to support the bill. And indeed, the day after they played a big Monday night bill, Malcolm Jenkins, Tory Smith, and Chris Long got on the train from Harrisburg, or from Philadelphia to Harrisburg, and spoke in favor of the bill and frankly helped break that logjam that was keeping the bill from moving forward in the House, and brought visibility to it, really surprising and very useful. But again, simply showing that even the issues that we've heard play out with the NFL over the past season became connected with this issue in a way that was very positive. I think that the players got a great deal of plaudits for not simply protesting racial inequity, but for lining up behind a specific bill and explaining why this was the sort of thing that they were trying to draw attention to. And it played really well in Harrisburg. Rebecca, turning it back over to you.
Thanks, Sharon. So I'll take, oh, you already moved me to the next slide. Thank you so much. So one of the things that has been particularly exciting to watch and to be part of in the time since Pennsylvania started to get attention for being the first in the nation to take on this clean slate automatic sealing model, and the NFL players had a little something to do with that, as did all of the other folks jumping on the campaign and giving it national attention and resulting in some national headlines as well, is funders started to raise their hands and realize that this was something that was a model that could be replicated in other states. And so thanks to the generous support of the Kellogg Foundation, CAP was able to come together with CLS and our friends at NELP, the National Employment Law Project, to launch a 3-year multi-state campaign to bring Clean Slate to a whole range of other states and to move that work in tandem with some work that will also be of interest to this group, but which we're not talking about on this webinar, which is fair chance licensing reforms, better known in some circles as occupational licensing reforms. The states that we have now moved into and have provided support for standing up public education campaigns for clean slate policies now include Michigan, where the Kellogg Foundation is based, as well as Colorado and South Carolina. And there are a number of other states that have gotten in touch with us or with other folks to say, hey, we're really interested in clean slate as well and want to think about how to do this where we are. One of the things that makes that extremely possible to do is that we very intentionally constructed the clean slate model to be as flexible as possible. Not one size fits all, always has to look the same way, but as Sharon mentioned several slides back, it can be dialed up or dialed down on a number of different fronts to fit a state's political climate as well as its policy and legislative landscape, where it already is on record clearing, where it makes sense to go, where the need is, and how that fits with what's already in place in terms of remedies. And so that can be both making the waiting period before automatic sealing occurs longer or shorter than the 10 years in Pennsylvania's bill. It can be about which types of offenses and records are eligible for clean slate sealing. For example, Michigan is interested in going up to drug felonies, and that makes a lot of sense in that state. That may not be what makes the most sense in South Carolina, where it's a very different looking legislature and there's a different record clearing landscape there. So excited to be now in a number of different states and very excited to be talking with you guys about where else it may make sense to take clean slate and make it take off like it has in Pennsylvania. I'll also note that in the coming possibly days, because we are in Second Chance Month right now and anything can happen in Second Chance Month, Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rochester, who represents Delaware in Congress, is going to be introducing a federal clean slate bill drawing on the Pennsylvania model, but applying to federal offenses that are minor, letting people get those automatically sealed after they've remained crime-free for a certain period of time, just like at the state level. So stay tuned for that in the coming days or weeks, but exciting to see this gain traction, not just in the states, but now also at the federal level. And then Sharon, I think that takes us to our last slide, if you want to share what kinds of resources we have there, and then I guess we'll open it up for questions.
So we have put together a clean slate toolkit that has a number of things you may want to look at if you're interested in thinking about bringing clean slate to your state. It includes the Pennsylvania bill as a model. It includes some of the op-eds and such that we mentioned, some background on the technological piece and how we figured out in Pennsylvania what the right size was and figured out that it would work. Let me just stay on that for a minute and digress 1 minute, something I might have said earlier had I thought of it. Very important to bring in those agencies that would be tasked to actually run clean slate before you get too far into a campaign, because you want to know that it actually can be done and that they will agree that it can be done, whether or not they may want to do it. And of course, you want to make them want to do it. So I would recommend that you start very early with your courts and your central repository to bring them in. But anyway, in our toolkit, you'll find some information about how we've done what we've done so far in the Pennsylvania bill, so that you can see how it can work. Certainly, CLS and CAP can help you with some advice. And I suppose if there were a third bullet here, it would be that we're very eagerly looking to find out what other foundation or other resources we might find to help support this advocacy in other states. So stay tuned about whether other foundations might join the Kellogg Foundation in having interest in providing some support for this kind of educational campaign. And with that, we have our contact at CLS if you want to give any of us a shout about a general conversation about this bill beyond what we've talked about. And with that, I think we're ready to take any questions.
All right. Thanks to both of you. This is Alex Lessman once again at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. The first question we have for you is, has there been any discussion about getting the clean slate model going in states with upcoming Medicaid work requirements?
That's a great question. I mean, I think Sharon and I can probably say that we have certainly not had or been part of a conversation that has been targeted in that specific way, but it is an intersection that we're certainly thinking about, given that, as this group will be more familiar with than most humans, that people with criminal records are going to be among those with the most at risk in the ongoing push for work requirements in Medicaid, harsher work requirements in the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, also known as food stamps, and possibly also housing assistance and anywhere else that President Trump and Speaker Ryan and their colleagues in Congress can think of to take away health insurance and food and housing and other basics that humans need for survival if they are not working 20, 25 or more hours per week or exempt under certain categories. So because of the employment discrimination that people with records face, a lot of those folks are going to be the ones who end up losing the basics while they're trying to embark upon successful reentry, and that's absolutely something that we've been doing a lot of work on and education around. Sharon has been leading a lot of that work, including comments on a rulemaking moving through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, making sure that folks have what they need to be out there and out front, elevating that intersection and that population as at risk. On not just the legislative front, but also the executive front as these threats materialize and progress. But Sharon, I don't know if you have more to say about any specific targeting that you've been thinking about in terms of taking the legislative and education campaigns to states like Arkansas, Indiana, Kentucky, Michigan, and other places where the Medicaid work requirements discussion is live.
Not really. I think you've covered it well, but obviously there is, as you point out, everyone on this call will know, a much bigger challenge for people with records being able to comply with any work requirement. And the reason my program, my legal aid program, gets 1,000 applicants for legal services seeking help with their criminal records every year is that they really want to work. Inevitably, that is why they are coming here. And so sealing is a major way to make them able to work, which should not only help them keep SNAP, but hopefully will make them eventually independent of benefits if they're able to move forward in their lives as a result of sealing. So I understand the connection that's being drawn here.
And I'll amend what I said just to note the obvious, which is that Michigan, which is one of the states I named because of a legislative fight happening right now around Medicaid work requirements that actually blew up in earnest this week because of a hearing that was held, I believe it actually may have been earlier today, in that state. Michigan, with its Live Clean Slate campaign, is the state where there is an intersection between a Live Clean Slate campaign and a live Medicaid work requirements debate. But it is certainly a great point. And something that we're thinking about from an advocacy perspective on the Medicaid front, and something that's very much worth thinking about in terms of targeting where Clean Slate may be most needed if we are not successful as an advocacy community in beating back these work requirements in Medicaid at the state level.
The next question is, can you tell us more about the plans for technical implementation of the law, and are there any technical hurdles you anticipate?
Really not, at least not in Pennsylvania. We had a full-day meeting back in November of 2015, maybe, or was it 2016? Anyway, it was in November in the last couple of years, which involved all the tech people from the state police, the Administrative Office of Courts, us as the advocates, the legislative sponsors, to really work through, is this a doable proposal? And the stakeholders, the agency stakeholders, had to agree that it was. If they're being asked to run a query, that they have the data to run, they ought to be able to do it. And they analyzed what was being asked of them. And frankly, as amendments are made to the bills, and I will tell you there have been what seemed to me like almost infinite amendments to the bills as various stakeholders have had their input, the queries get ever more complicated, but there's still computer queries that can be run. So they have had input even into the legislative language, those two agencies. They are comfortable that it can be done. I think from the court's perspective, they even understand that they have room to benefit from all of this work being done automatically, which currently the court system is paying a lot of people to work on. Here in Philadelphia, we've had a dozen people working on just implementing expungement orders. If that could be done automatically through sealing, that is a lot fewer staff that they have to deploy towards that. So they've come around and agreed that it can be done and that they're prepared to do it. One thing they've asked for, which we of course have agreed with, is that there be a substantial implementation time for all those cases going back into the past. That's where we're talking about very large numbers of cases that will be newly eligible for automatic sealing. And I believe we've given almost 2 years for that part of implementation to be finished, because we understand it's very important not to have the implementation go wrong. So giving them enough time to test, write queries, work out the kinks, seems like an appropriate thing to do, even though people are very anxious for this to get started.
The only thing I would add to that is that it's not unexpected or unusual or anything even really to be all that concerned about for folks in state government to hear this and go, that's not ever going to be possible in my state. And just because folks who are supposed to be technical experts on their own record systems say that at the outset doesn't mean that it's actually true. That is certainly what we heard from certain stakeholders in Pennsylvania state government before we showed them how it could be true. And I say we very generously to myself because it was Sharon showing them how it could be done. And so just saying that out loud, because it is something to expect as part of the process, is reluctance and resistance on the part of state bureaucrats who may say this isn't possible when in fact it very much is, and it's just, you know, about resistance to change.
And in my experience, sometimes it's the tech folk in particular who are very frightened and reluctant and not eager to spend a lot of time figuring out how to make this work, who are the big naysayers. But for instance, at the court level, if your state Supreme Court comes in and says, we're very interested in this idea, that can sometimes change the dynamics in the agency.
The next question is a two-part. How many states have the technological systems necessary to do this? And if no tech system that will work is in place, could it be mandated in the same bill that provides for clean slate?
I suppose that it could be mandated in the same bill, but bear in mind that is going to be probably a big undertaking requiring big financial resources. So I think if your state is not yet centralized and has good enough data, you're looking at clean slate a couple of years down the road. It would probably make sense to start on building the data first. And that would be great for many reasons other than implementing clean slate. As probably many of you know, criminal record data is not quite as perfect as the public might think it is. So efforts to centralize, improve would be a good place to start. But it really is something that, you know, I think you would need to expend significant resources on improving the data before you could move to clean slate. I want to go back and say one thing about cost of all of this. The fiscal notes, after we had all these long meetings with the administrative agencies, turned out to be virtually nothing. They said that with a small investment of resources, maybe for some computer consultants to help make sure it works right, and I mean small, I mean, you know, like less than $100,000 for a proposal like this, one-time expenditure, that would be it. And I think the House appropriations note, which we just saw, the fiscal note, was nothing beyond the regular operations budgets of the agencies.
Next question is, in the future when labor markets are not so tight, could business support for clean slate evaporate? Maybe, but the optimist in me makes me feel like everybody's getting used to saying this is a good idea. And so it just feels like making inroads that are not going to disappear just because the economic situation changes. Rebecca, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I'm going to be the optimist, which I don't know if that's usual or unusual when we're paired together, Sharon. I'll be good cop. I think that this is something that folks who think from the business perspective, the employer perspective, they have not been citing a labor market slack. They have not been citing recession or recovery times as the reason that they've been interested in this idea. It's been because they get that 1 in 3 Americans now have some type of criminal record, and that's shutting millions upon millions of skilled workers out of the workforce in ways that are not good for them, not good for our broader society, not good for their families, and the half of kids who now have one parent with or more with a criminal record and who face all kinds of barriers to economic security on their own part because of the barriers that their parents are facing due to their records. There are a lot of reasons that folks on not just left but also right have gotten into this idea and embraced it. And I don't know that that is something that's likely to change as we see a tighter labor market that's still shutting out people with records in such great numbers.
Many thanks to both of our presenters, Sharon Dietrich and Rebecca Vallas. For any additional questions, you may email the presenters directly or email cleanslate@csgjusticecenter.org, and we will answer those questions ourselves or forward them to the appropriate person. We encourage you also to sign up for our newsletter at cleanslateclearinghouse.org to receive information on future webinars and other announcements. We also encourage you to share this resource with your networks. Thank you very much for joining the webinar today, and have a great afternoon.